So today I'm back on Starfield and we're going to be checking out FSR 3 versus DLSS with the RTX 3080. And we'll start it off at 1080p at the ultra settings with no upscaling. Okay, finally in the game, and we're sitting in the high 50s and the low 60s. That's pretty crazy. We are playing at 1080p with no upscaling again, and the 3080 is barely holding on to 60 FPS in the Atlantis. So when this game came out initially, I was playing at 1440p with DLSS at the high settings, I believe, and even with that, I was still falling below 60 and landing in the low 50s and the mid 50s in those heavier scenes. So the game is pretty intensive, so I do hope with FSR 3 we can get like 80 to 90 FPS and above at the ultra settings. Second location will be indoors on this little ship, and so far guys we're sitting in the 150s and the 160s. At this point the game feels amazing, the responsiveness is incredible, but as you're going to see, this does fall down quite a bit in the next situation. So if I walk down here and shoot the barrels, the FPS falls down into the mid 70s and the high 60s even. So yeah, a bit better than New Atlantis, but still it does fall down quite a bit from the 150s all the way down into the high 60s. That is crazy. Let's back out though, enable DLSS, try it again. And now with DLSS at the quality preset, the game is now sitting in the high 60s and the mid 60s. So around a 10 FPS increase, and the graphics look pretty good as well. So definitely usable, but it does still fall down below 60 FPS in certain areas. So even with DLSS, we can't hold a stable 60 at ultra 1080p. That is insane. And once again, back indoors, obviously beforehand we could hold 60 FPS just fine, but now with DLSS we are sitting in the 80s and the 90s with the fire on screen. So yeah, more headroom is always better, and with DLSS it does just that. Alright, finally time for FSR 3 with frame gen. Let's see if 60 FPS stable is possible in New Atlantis. And now with FSR 3 with frame gen, we're now sitting in the 110s and the 120s in New Atlantis. Off the bat I can see some trailing near the NPCs. It isn't as good as DLSS, but the environment is as good as DLSS. So mostly it does look pretty good, but again the characters look a bit off and they have a bit of ghosting and trailing as they walk forward. Now for the input lag, it feels fine. It feels like around 70 FPS on average, so it's all good there. Again, the main issue are the characters. And looking back here, we can see the FPS fall down into the low 100s and even the 90s. And yeah, real quick, let's go through the indoor section as well. So far in the 250s, which is insane, way higher than before. It falls down into the 160s and the high 150s. I think for me, for 1080p, I would ignore the NPC issues and just use this instead of DLSS. Time for 1440p, and we're back to no upscaling, just at native, and still at the ultra settings. So far guys, we're sitting in the high 40s and the low 50s. It's about right to be honest for this card. It's definitely playable. It's not as responsive obviously as 60 FPS, but on a controller, it does feel quite decent. And yeah, for the graphics guys, it looks amazing. It's super sharp, looks incredible, and it's how it's meant to be played. Alright, back indoors guys, and yeah, so far in the 110s and the 120s, again quite good, but going outside, and the fire makes the FPS fall down into the low 50s and the mid 40s, just like New Atlantis. So yeah, a giant FPS dip. It doesn't feel great at all. If you're against upscaling, then use an FPS cap of 40 here and play on a controller, and it should be pretty good. Alright, anyway, let's back out, enable DLSS. Alright, balance DLSS, and we're sitting in the 60s and the mid 60s. Now for personal experience, this does fall down below 60 FPS in those heavier scenes, so keep that in mind. But yeah, so far guys, it looks amazing, as good as native pretty much, and I can't see the same issues with the NPCs as I did with FSR. So yeah, pretty good, there's no stutters, and you're right here, it does fall down into the mid 50s, like I said it would. Now although it fell below 60 FPS in New Atlantis, with the fire on the screen, it can actually hold 60 FPS just fine. Alright, FSR 3 with frame gen in New Atlantis. So far guys, we're sitting in the 110s. So that is pretty crazy compared to DLSS. And the game overall looks pretty good. It isn't as good as DLSS, a bit softer, but overall it does look pretty good. And overall for the FPS, does much better. So it's really up to you. If you want to get the most graphics out of the game, then use DLSS and you get a small FPS bump on top. But if you care about a mix of both, then use FSR 3 with frame gen. It looks good for the most part, and FPS wise, far higher with decent input lag. Alright, lastly, 4K native, and so far guys, we're sitting in the mid 30s and the low 30s. Now personally in New Atlantis, it doesn't fall below 30 FPS, but as you can expect, it does fall below 30 with the fire on the screen, which I'll show you right now. And going indoors, we're starting it off at 60 FPS and above, pretty good actually, not too bad. and then with the fire on the screen, it all falls down into the high 20s and the mid 20s, and going as low as the low 20s, guys. Performance DLSS, we're now sitting in the 50s and the high 40s. It's honestly a pretty good FPS jump. We sat into the 30s here, the mid 30s on average, and for how good the game looks, it's free FPS pretty much. So if you are playing at 4K, then this is definitely a must-have. I think ideally for this card, I would play at a mix of medium and high at 4K instead of ultra, and 60 FPS is definitely far more doable. And now lastly, FSR 3 with FrameGen at 4K, and we're sitting in the high 70s and the low 80s. Now the input lag isn't fantastic, it feels like 40 to 50 FPS on average pretty much. And for the graphics, again, it isn't as good as DLSS, it's definitely softer, but it looks like TAA, so it looks good, and it's definitely usable, so it's really up to you. If you care about the performance, then use FSR 3, but if you want clarity and sharpness for 4K, then stick with DLSS. Okay, that's about it guys, thanks for watching, hope you guys enjoyed. I'll see you next time for the next video. See you guys there.